At our daughter's college graduation, standing right there next to the memorial garden where we'd planted roses for his mama, my husband of 32 years looked me dead in the eye and said, "Vivian, I found someone better." Then I turned around and saw her, a girl barely older than our Jasmine, wearing the diamond tennis bracelet I'd been admiring in the jewelry store window for 3 years, the one he said we couldn't afford because we were saving for Jasmine's medical school. But before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps give me the strength to speak my truth. Now let's get into my story. Standing there in my navy blue dress, the one I'd bought special for this day, the one that cost more than I usually spend on myself in 6 months, I felt something cold settle in my chest like winter morning frost. Not the hot flash of anger you might expect. Not the tears that any reasonable woman would shed. Just this bone-deep chill that made me understand, clear as Sunday morning church bells, that my whole life had just shifted off its foundation. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, with that smooth golden skin and those bright white teeth that come from never knowing a day of real worry. She had on a sundress the color of butter, and when she smiled at my Raymond, I could see she thought this was all some kind of game. Some kind of romantic movie where she was the beautiful young heroine stealing the distinguished older man from his boring wife. She didn't know she was looking at Vivian Washington, daughter of sharecroppers, granddaughter of slaves, a woman who had worked her fingers raw to put that man through law school when we didn't have 2 dimes to rub together. She didn't know she was smiling at a woman who had raised 4 children, 3 living and 1 we buried when he was just 7 months old, while her husband built his practice and his reputation on her backbone. "Raymond," I said, my voice steady as Sunday service, "this is our daughter's graduation day." He had the nerve to look annoyed, like I was interrupting something important instead of trying to save him from making the biggest fool of himself in front of 300 people. "I know what day it is, Vivian." That's exactly why I thought. Well, Jasmine's grown now. She doesn't need us to stay together for her sake anymore. Like this marriage had been some kind of burden we'd both been carrying instead of the life I'd built for him, stone by stone, dream by dream. Around us, other families were taking pictures, grandparents were crying happy tears, young people in caps and gowns were hugging their parents and making plans for celebration dinners. The May sunshine was warm on my shoulders, and somewhere in that crowd was my baby girl, probably looking for us so we could take the family photos we'd planned. The ones that would now show the exact moment her daddy decided to blow up everything she'd ever known about home and family, and the people who were supposed to love you no matter what. "And who is this?" I asked, looking directly at the girl. Up close, I could see she was wearing more makeup than I put on for Easter Sunday, trying to look older than she was. But those eyes were young eyes, the kind that hadn't seen enough of life's hardships to develop the good sense God gave a billy goat. "This is Amber," Raymond said, and his voice had this tone in it like he was introducing me to visiting royalty. "She works at the firm. She's very bright." Bright. Like intelligence was some rare quality he'd never encountered before, instead of something I'd been sharing with him across the dinner table for 3 decades. Like I hadn't been the one helping him prepare for the bar exam, drilling him on cases until 2 in the morning while I balanced a teething baby on my hip and worried about how we'd make rent if he didn't pass. Amber extended her hand to me like we were meeting at some society function instead of at the destruction of my marriage. "Mrs. Washington," she said in this little girl voice that probably sounded sweet to men who liked to feel important. "Ray has told me so much about you." Ray. Not Raymond. Not Mr. Washington like a woman with proper raising would call a married man old enough to be her father. Ray like they were old friends instead of, well, whatever they were. I took her hand because my mama raised me to have manners even when other folks forgot theirs. But I looked her right in the eye when I did it, and I let her see exactly who she was dealing with. Not some pathetic older woman who was going to fall apart and make a scene. Not some bitter wife who was going to beg and plead for her husband to stay. I let her see Vivian Washington, the woman who had survived everything life threw at her and was still standing. "Has he now?" I said, still holding her hand just a little too long. "And what exactly did Ray tell you about me?" She actually giggled. This child giggled at my daughter's graduation while she was wearing my husband's gifts and planning to take my place. "Oh, you know, that you're very traditional. Set in your ways." Traditional. Set in my ways. Like being faithful to your marriage vows was some old-fashioned quirk instead of the foundation that had held our family together through layoffs and sick babies. And the year Raymond's daddy died and left debts we had to pay off. "Vivian," Raymond said, and now he sounded impatient, like I was the one causing problems instead of the one being informed that my life was over. "We need to talk about this properly. About how we're going to handle things going forward." Handle things. Like 32 years of marriage was just some business arrangement that needed to be dissolved with the right paperwork. I looked around at all these families celebrating their children's achievements. At all these parents who had sacrificed and saved and worried and prayed to get their babies to this moment. I thought about our Jasmine, who was probably wondering where her parents were while her daddy stood there planning to destroy her sense of security and family stability on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. And then I thought about something else. Something that made that cold feeling in my chest spread out into something that felt almost like relief. I thought about the life insurance policies that listed me as the beneficiary. I thought about the house that we'd bought with my teacher's pension as collateral, the house that had both our names on the deed but my steady employment history on the mortgage application. I thought about the retirement accounts we'd built together, the savings account that had grown from my careful budgeting and coupon clipping, and making meals stretch to feed 4 people on a budget meant for 2. I thought about the fact that Raymond Washington, Esquire, successful small-town lawyer with the fancy office and the expensive suits, had built his whole life on the foundation of my stability, my good sense, my willingness to work 2 jobs while he established his practice. I thought about how his success had my fingerprints all over it, from the nights I stayed up typing his briefs when we couldn't afford a secretary to the connections I'd made through the church and my teaching job that sent clients his way. Most of all, I thought about how a man who was stupid enough to throw away a good woman for a pretty young thing probably wasn't smart enough to read the fine print on all those documents he'd been signing for the past 3 decades. "You're absolutely right, Raymond," I said, and my voice was as sweet as the tea I served at church socials. "We do need to talk about how we're going to handle things going forward. But not today. Today is about Jasmine. Today is about celebrating our daughter's achievement." I turned to Amber with a smile that would have made my Sunday school teacher proud. "I'm sure you understand, dear. Family comes first." Then I walked away from them, my head high and my back straight, to go find my daughter and tell her how proud I was of her. Because Jasmine had earned this day. And I wasn't going to let her daddy's midlife crisis steal 1 minute of the joy she deserved. But as I walked through that crowd of celebrating families, my mind was already working. Already planning. Already thinking about all the ways a traditional set-in-her-ways woman might surprise a man who thought he knew everything about handling things. The graduation ceremony was beautiful, just like we'd hoped it would be. Jasmine looked radiant in her cap and gown, and when they called her name for her degree in pre-med, I cheered loud enough for both her parents. She found me anyway, because Raymond and his little friend had disappeared somewhere, and threw her arms around me like she used to do when she was small and I was the person who could fix anything that went wrong in her world. "Mama, where's Daddy?" she asked, looking around with those bright eyes that reminded me so much of my own mama. "I wanted to get pictures with both of you." "Your daddy had to step away for a minute, baby," I said, smoothing her hair the way I'd done since she was born. "But we'll get all the pictures you want. This is your day." And we did take pictures. Me and Jasmine, me and her boyfriend Marcus, who was a good boy from a good family, me with her and some of her friends who called me Mrs. V and always asked about my cooking when they came to visit. We took pictures that showed a family celebrating. A mother who was proud of her daughter's accomplishments. A woman who was exactly where she belonged. I didn't tell Jasmine what her daddy had said. Not that day. That news would come soon enough, and when it did, I wanted to be ready with a plan that would protect her as much as possible from the chaos Raymond was about to bring into all our lives. But that night, after the graduation dinner at her favorite restaurant, just me and Jasmine and Marcus, because Raymond was still nowhere to be found, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and started making lists. I made a list of all our assets, all our accounts, all our investments and properties and insurance policies. I made a list of all the ways I had contributed to Raymond's success, all the evidence I could gather of my role in building what he probably thought of as his career and his achievements. I made a list of all the things Amber probably didn't know about the man she thought she was winning. Most importantly, I made a list of all the things Raymond probably didn't know about me. He didn't know that I had been keeping careful records of our finances for 32 years, not because I didn't trust him, but because my mama had taught me that a smart woman always knows exactly where she stands. He didn't know that I had been quietly building relationships and making connections through my work, through the church, through the community organizations I volunteered with, creating a network of people who respected Vivian Washington and knew what kind of woman I was. He didn't know that his traditional set-in-her-ways wife had been taking business classes at the community college for the past 5 years, learning about investments and tax law and small business management, preparing for the retirement we were supposed to share together. And he definitely didn't know that the quiet, supportive wife who had been content to let him be the face of our success was about to show him exactly what happened when you underestimate a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated. I finished my coffee, put my lists in a folder, and went to bed in the house that I had helped pay for, in the room where I had slept beside a man who apparently thought 32 years of marriage was something he could just walk away from whenever something better came along. Tomorrow I would start making some phone calls. Tomorrow I would start putting together the kind of plan that a smart, traditional, set-in-her-ways woman makes when she's been pushed too far. But tonight I slept better than I had in months, because for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first phone call I made Monday morning was to my cousin Geneva, who worked in the records department at the courthouse. Now, I want to be clear about something. I wasn't asking Geneva to do anything improper. Public records are public records, and a woman has every right to know exactly what's been filed in her own name over the past 3 decades. "Vivian, honey," Geneva said when I explained what I needed. "You sure you want to go digging around in all this? Sometimes it's better to just let sleeping dogs lie." "Geneva," I said, sitting at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad in front of me, "sometimes sleeping dogs wake up and bite you anyway. I'd rather know what I'm dealing with." By Wednesday, I had copies of every deed, every mortgage document, every business filing that had Raymond's signature on it. What I found was more interesting than I'd expected. It seems my husband, the successful lawyer, had been a little careless about the details when it came to his own paperwork. The house, our house, the one where we'd raised Jasmine and buried 3 dogs and hosted countless Sunday dinners, was in both our names, just like I remembered. But the mortgage, the one we'd refinanced twice to help Raymond expand his practice, was secured primarily by my teacher's pension and my spotless credit history. The bank had required both our signatures, but their risk assessment was based on my steady employment and reliable income. Even more interesting was the business loan Raymond had taken out 5 years ago to move his practice to that fancy office downtown. Guess whose name was on that paperwork as a co-signer? Guess whose credit history and assets were used as collateral when the bank decided Raymond Washington, Esquire, was worth the risk? That's right. Traditional, set-in-her-ways Vivian Washington had guaranteed her husband's professional success with her own financial stability. And according to the fine print that I read very carefully with my community college business classes fresh in my mind, that made me a whole lot more than just a wife who could be discarded when something better came along. My second phone call was to Sarah Chan, who taught the business law class I'd taken last semester. Sarah was a sharp young woman who'd left a big law firm to teach, because she wanted to help people understand their rights. She owed me a few favors after I'd helped her daughter with math tutoring, and she agreed to meet me for coffee on Thursday morning. "Mrs. Washington," she said, looking over the documents I brought, this is quite a situation. Your husband is an attorney, correct? He had to know what he was signing when he put your name on these agreements. I'm starting to think my husband knows a lot of things he's been pretending not to know," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "The question is, what can I do about it?" Sarah spread the papers out on the coffee shop table between us, pointing to specific clauses and signatures. "Well, legally speaking, you're not just a spouse in this situation. You're a business partner. You've guaranteed his debts, secured his loans, and contributed to the assets that built his practice. That gives you certain rights and protections, especially in divorce proceedings." Divorce proceedings. There it was, the word I'd been avoiding in my own mind, even though Raymond had made it clear that was where we were headed. "What kind of rights?" I asked. Sarah smiled, and I could see why her students liked her. "The kind that might surprise a man who thinks he can walk away from a 32-year partnership without consequences. The kind that recognize your contributions to marital assets that were built with both your labor and your guarantees." I left that coffee shop with a much clearer understanding of my situation and a referral to Margaret Foster, a divorce attorney who specialized in cases where one spouse had built a career on the other's support. Sarah also gave me some advice that stayed with me. Document everything. Keep records. And don't let him know what you're planning until you're ready to act. That afternoon I started my documentation project. I went through 32 years of photographs, tax returns, bank statements, and personal records. I made copies of everything that showed my contributions to our life together. The years I worked 2 jobs while Raymond was in law school, the times I used my teacher's connections to send clients his way, the community events where I represented our family while he was building his reputation. I found pictures of me typing his briefs at the kitchen table while Jasmine did homework beside me. I found thank you notes from clients who'd come to him because of recommendations from other teachers at my school. I found records of every time my salary had covered our mortgage when his practice was slow, every time my benefits had paid for our family's health care, every investment we'd made with money I'd saved from my careful budgeting. Most importantly, I found the original partnership papers for Raymond's practice. The ones from 15 years ago, when he'd brought in 2 junior partners to help expand the firm. The ones that listed me as an emergency contact and decision maker in case something happened to Raymond. The ones that gave me, as his spouse and the guarantor of his business loans, certain rights in the firm's operations. Raymond had forgotten about those papers, I was sure of it. They were from back when he still treated me like a partner in everything, back when he made decisions with my input and valued my opinion. Back before success made him think he was too good for the woman who'd helped him achieve it. On Friday morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to work. Not because I was physically ill, but because I needed a day to think and plan without distractions. I made myself a proper breakfast, put on my best thinking clothes, and sat down to design what my business professors would have called a strategic response to a hostile takeover. Because that's what Raymond was trying to do, wasn't it? Take over my life, discard the parts that no longer served him, and keep the benefits without the responsibilities. Well, 2 could play that game. The doorbell rang around 10 o'clock, and I wasn't surprised to see Raymond standing on the porch. He looked tired, older than he had at graduation, and his expensive suit was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. "Vivian," he said, "we need to talk." "Yes," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "We certainly do." He walked into our living room, the room we'd decorated together, where we'd watched Jasmine take her first steps, where we'd held hands during the worst moments of our marriage and celebrated during the best ones. He looked around like he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe like he was saying goodbye to it. "I know this is hard," he began, using that lawyer voice he probably thought would make me more reasonable. "But I think we can handle this like adults. I've been thinking about terms. Terms. Like our marriage was a contract that had expired instead of a life we'd built together." "Have you now?" I said, settling into my favorite chair and folding my hands in my lap. "And what kind of terms did you have in mind?" He sat down across from me, and for a moment he looked like the young man I'd married, uncertain and hopeful. Then he straightened up and became the successful lawyer again, the man who was used to negotiating deals and getting what he wanted. "I think we should keep this simple," he said. "Clean break, minimal disruption. I'll take responsibility for my business debts, you can have the house and your retirement accounts. We'll split everything else down the middle." I almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead I asked, "And what about your practice? Your office, your client list, your reputation?" "Well, naturally that stays with me. That's my career, Vivian. That's what I've built. What I've built. Not what we'd built together. Not what had been financed by my guarantees and supported by my sacrifices. What he'd built, like I'd been nothing more than a bystander to my own life." "Raymond," I said, my voice still calm and reasonable, "I've been doing some reading this week. About business partnerships, about marital property, about the rights of people who guarantee other people's debts." Something flickered in his eyes then, something that might have been worry. "Vivian, what are you getting at?" "I'm getting at the fact that your practice, your office, your reputation, they weren't built just by you. They were built by us. With my credit, my collateral, my guarantees. Which means they're not just yours to walk away with." Now he looked genuinely concerned. "Vivian, you're not thinking clearly. You're upset, and I understand that, but you need to be practical here." "Practical? Like I hadn't been being practical for 32 years while he pursued his dreams on my foundation. "Oh, I'm being very practical," I said. "I'm thinking about the partnership papers you signed 15 years ago, the ones that give me decision-making authority if you're not capable of running the business responsibly. I'm thinking about the loans I guaranteed, the debts I secured, the assets we built together that you seem to think you can just claim as your own." Raymond stood up then, and I could see the lawyer in him starting to panic. "You can't be serious. You don't know anything about running a law practice." "No," I agreed, "I don't. But I know about running a business. I know about managing finances. I know about building relationships and maintaining professional standards. And I know that when someone guarantees a debt, they have rights regarding how that debt is managed." I stood up too, facing my husband across the living room where we'd made so many decisions together. "I also know that when someone decides to break up a 32-year partnership, there are consequences. Legal consequences. Financial consequences. Professional consequences." "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was quieter now. What did I want? I wanted the last week to have never happened. I wanted my husband to remember why he'd loved me enough to marry me. I wanted my daughter to still believe in love and family, and the idea that people who promise to stay together actually mean it. But since I couldn't have any of those things, I'd settle for something else. "I want you to understand that I'm not just your wife, Raymond. I'm your partner. I always have been, whether you acknowledged it or not. And partners don't get discarded without compensation." He sat back down, and I could see him starting to calculate, starting to think like the lawyer he was instead of the guilty husband he'd been trying to be. "So what are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything yet," I said. "I'm still gathering information, still consulting with experts, still figuring out exactly what my rights are, and how I want to exercise them." I walked to the window and looked out at the garden we'd planted together, the roses that were just starting to bloom. "But I'll tell you what I'm not doing, Raymond. I'm not quietly disappearing so you can start fresh with your young girlfriend. I'm not pretending that 32 years of marriage and partnership means nothing. And I'm definitely not letting you walk away with everything we built together, while leaving me to start over at 63 with whatever scraps you think I deserve." When I turned around, he was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "I never knew you could be so," he started. "So what? So strong? So smart? So capable of standing up for myself?" I shook my head. "That's the problem, Raymond. You stopped seeing me as a whole person a long time ago. You started thinking of me as just the comfortable wife who would always be there, always support your dreams, always put your needs first." I sat back down, smoothing my skirt with hands that were perfectly steady. "Well, let me tell you something, husband. Comfortable doesn't mean weak. Supportive doesn't mean stupid. And traditional doesn't mean I don't know my worth." Raymond left that afternoon with a lot more to think about than he'd arrived with. And I spent the evening making more lists, more plans, more preparations for the conversation we were going to have when I was good and ready to have it. Because this traditional, set-in-her-ways woman was about to give her husband and his girlfriend an education they'd never forget. 3 weeks after that conversation in our living room, I was ready to make my move. I'd spent those weeks like a general preparing for battle. Not the kind of battle that destroys everything in its path, but the kind that achieves victory through superior strategy and preparation. My first stop was Margaret Foster's law office downtown. Margaret was everything Sarah Chun had promised: sharp, experienced, and completely unsympathetic to men who thought they could discard loyal wives without consequences. Her office walls were covered with thank you letters from women who discovered they were stronger than they knew. "Mrs. Washington," she said, reviewing the file I'd prepared, "I have to say, this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've seen in 20 years of practice. You've built an airtight argument for your contributions to marital assets. My business professor taught me to always support my arguments with evidence," I said, smoothing my skirt. I was wearing my best suit, the burgundy one I saved for parent-teacher conferences and important occasions. "What exactly are my options?" Margaret spread the documents across her conference table, like she was laying out a winning hand of cards. "Option 1. We file for divorce and demand full recognition of your partnership interest in his practice. Given that you guaranteed the business loans and contributed directly to building the client base, you're entitled to at least 50% of the firm's value. I nodded, making notes in my careful handwriting. Option 2. We exercise your rights under the partnership agreement. As a guarantor of the business debts with decision-making authority, you can legally demand changes in how the practice is managed, including personnel decisions. Personnel decisions. That was interesting. Option 3, Margaret continued with a small smile. We do both. File for divorce with full asset division, and simultaneously exercise your partnership rights to protect the business during the transition. And what would that look like practically? I asked. It would mean that Raymond couldn't make any major business decisions without your approval. He couldn't take on new partners, couldn't relocate the practice, couldn't even hire or fire employees without your consent. Essentially, you become his business partner whether he likes it or not. I thought about Raymond's face when he realized that the woman he was trying to discard actually had legal authority over the career he thought was entirely his own. How long would this take to implement? We can file the papers today. He'd be served by tomorrow afternoon. I made my decision. Let's proceed with option 3. The next morning, I did something I'd been thinking about for days. I drove to Raymond's office, the fancy downtown office that my guarantees had helped him afford, and asked to speak with Amber. The receptionist, a sweet older lady named Dorothy who'd always been kind to me at firm Christmas parties, looked confused. Mrs. Washington? Is everything all right? Mr. Washington is in court this morning. I know where my husband is, Dorothy. I'd like to speak with Amber, please. Is she available? Dorothy's expression told me she'd heard the office gossip, seen the signs, maybe even witnessed some of the inappropriate behavior that had been going on. Of course, Mrs. Washington. Let me get her for you. Amber came out looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. She was wearing a tight pencil skirt and a blouse that showed more than it covered, the kind of outfit that was probably meant to be professional but missed the mark by about 6 inches of hemline. Mrs. Washington, she said, trying to sound confident but not quite managing it. What can I do for you? We need to have a conversation, dear, I said in my sweetest voice. Is there somewhere private we can talk? She led me to one of the small conference rooms, the kind where Raymond met with clients who couldn't afford his premium services. How appropriate. Amber, I said once we were seated, I want you to understand something about the situation you've gotten yourself into. She lifted her chin like she was preparing for a fight. Look, Mrs. Washington, I know you're upset, but Ray and we didn't plan for this to happen. Sometimes people just fall in love. Fall in love. Like what she and Raymond had was some grand romance instead of a middle-aged man's ego trip and a young woman's misguided attempt to land financial security. Sweetheart, I said, opening the folder I'd brought with me. I'm not here to fight with you about love. I'm here to give you some information you're going to need. I spread out copies of the legal documents Margaret had prepared. The divorce filing, the partnership claim, the demand for asset evaluation. What is this? Amber asked, her voice getting smaller. This is reality, I said. This is what happens when a man tries to walk away from a 32-year business partnership without understanding the legal implications. I pointed to specific sections of the documents, explaining them in the patient voice I used with struggling students. You see, Raymond isn't just my husband. He's my business partner. I guaranteed his loans, secured his debts, and contributed to building everything he thinks he owns. Amber was reading now, her face getting paler with each page. What this means, I continued, is that I own 50% of this law firm. I have legal authority over major business decisions, and I'm about to exercise those rights. But Ray said he owned the practice. He said after the divorce he'd be free to do whatever he wanted. Ray told you a lot of things that weren't quite accurate, I said gently. For instance, did he tell you about the partnership agreement that gives me veto power over hiring and firing decisions? She shook her head. Did he mention that the fancy office lease is secured by debts I guaranteed, which means I have say over whether those debts continue to be honored? Another head shake. Did he explain that his client list was built partially through connections I provided, and that I have legal claims to the ongoing value of those relationships? By now, Amber was looking like she might be sick. Honey, I said, leaning forward with genuine sympathy. I know you thought you were getting involved with a successful independent businessman, But what you actually got involved with was a man who built his success on his wife's foundation, and then forgot to read the fine print when he decided to throw that wife away. I gathered up the papers and put them back in my folder. Now, I'm not a vindictive woman. I'm not interested in destroying anyone's life or causing unnecessary pain. But I am interested in protecting what's mine and making sure people understand the consequences of their choices. Amber was crying now, quiet tears that were smearing her carefully applied makeup. What? What does this mean for me? Well, I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. That depends on how smart you are and how quickly you learn. I walked to the door, then turned back. You see, dear, as a partner in this firm, I have the right to approve or disapprove employee conduct that might reflect poorly on our professional reputation. Workplace romances, especially ones involving married partners, tend to create liability issues that I, as a business owner, simply cannot tolerate. The meaning was clear. She could end the relationship with Raymond, or she could end her employment. Possibly both. I'll let you think about your options, I said. But don't take too long. Business decisions can't wait indefinitely. I left that office with my head high and my conscience clear. I hadn't been cruel or vindictive. I'd simply explained the reality of the situation to someone who clearly hadn't understood what she was getting into. The papers were served to Raymond that afternoon while he was meeting with a client. Dorothy called me at home to let me know. Her voice carefully professional but with an undertone that suggested she was rather enjoying the drama. Mrs. Washington, your husband asked me to tell you he'll be coming by the house this evening to discuss the documents he received today. Thank you, Dorothy. Please tell him I'll be available after 7. Raymond arrived at 7:15, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who just realized he'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Vivian, he said, not bothering with pleasantries, we need to talk about these papers. Yes, I said, settling into my chair with a cup of tea. I imagine we do. He sat down across from me and opened his briefcase, pulling out copies of the legal documents and several pages of his own notes. You can't be serious about this, he said. You don't want to own half of a law practice. You're a teacher, not a lawyer. You're absolutely right, I said calmly. I don't want to own half of a law practice. What I want is to be treated with the respect and recognition I've earned as your partner in building that practice. So what do you want? He asked, the question he should have started with 3 weeks ago. I set down my teacup and looked at the man I'd shared my life with for 32 years. I want acknowledgement of my contributions to our shared success. I want compensation that reflects my role in building the assets you think you can walk away with. I want protection for Jasmine's future that doesn't depend on your current emotional state. I paused, letting that sink in. And I want assurance that when you start your new life, you won't be doing it by financially devastating the woman who made your old life possible. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes like they might provide answers to questions he hadn't thought to ask before. What would that look like? He asked finally. It would look like a fair division of assets that recognizes my contributions. It would look like ongoing support that reflects the standard of living we built together. It would look like respect for the fact that I sacrificed my own career advancement to support yours. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where framed photos showed 32 years of shared life, weddings, birthdays, graduations, holidays. Most importantly, Raymond, it would look like you understanding that actions have consequences. That you can't build a life on someone else's foundation, and then demolish that foundation when it no longer suits your purposes. When I turned around, he was looking at me with something that might have been respect. I never meant for it to be like this, he said quietly. No, I agreed. I don't think you did. I think you just stopped thinking about anyone but yourself. We talked for 2 more hours that night. Not the heated argument I'd expected, but a real conversation, maybe the first real conversation we'd had in years. By the end of it, we had the outline of an agreement that recognized my partnership in our shared success and provided for my future security. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I retained a 25% stake in Raymond's practice, enough to ensure my financial security, but not enough to interfere with his day-to-day operations. The house became mine, along with a fair share of our other assets and ongoing support that would allow me to maintain the life I'd helped build. Amber quit her job at the firm 2 days after our conversation and moved back to whatever small town she'd come from. I heard through Dorothy that she told people she decided she wasn't cut out for big city law practice after all. Raymond and I are civil now. We attend Jasmine's events together, celebrate holidays as a family when she's home, and treat each other with the respect that comes from understanding each other's true capabilities. He never remarried, and I sometimes wonder if he learned something from our experience about the difference between love and infatuation, between partnership and possession. As for me, I retired from teaching and used my settlement to start a consulting business helping other women understand their financial rights and legal options. It turns out that 32 years of managing a household, supporting a spouse's career, and navigating complex family dynamics had given me skills that other people valued. I kept the burgundy suit I wore to Margaret Foster's office, and I wear it whenever I need to remind myself that a woman's worth isn't determined by her husband's opinion of her. It's determined by her own understanding of what she's contributed to the world, and her willingness to stand up for that contribution when necessary. And every time someone describes me as traditional or set in my ways, I smile and think about the day I taught a successful lawyer and his young girlfriend that underestimating a woman is the most expensive mistake a person can make. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson you can teach someone is that respect isn't given. It's earned, demanded, and defended. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear quietly when someone tries to erase her contributions to her own life. That's my story. That's how I learned that being comfortable doesn't mean being weak, and being supportive doesn't mean being foolish. That's how I discovered that a woman who's spent 32 years building something has every right to protect what she's built, and every obligation to teach others that partnerships, whether in marriage or business, come with responsibilities that can't be dissolved with simple selfishness. And that's how I found out that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone else write the ending to your story.